Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's been about 4 months since I've done a video. I've been extremely busy. I apologize for not having time to do this. So I'm going to try to get back into this weekly again. Hopefully I can keep up with it. And today I have one of my favorite watches. This is actually one of my own personal watches that I've had in my collection for a little while. It's running good. It just needs a little maintenance. I bought this watch and it was serviced when I purchased it. I never really did anything to check it. It runs pretty well, but it doesn't really seem to run for a long time. So I just want to check everything, make sure everything's clean, and go through the whole watch. Let's get started with disassembly. You can see on these 4992B military watches, these are great World War II watches. They were used in bombers. They were used in the Navy for timing certain missions, bomb dropping, things like that. I've got a little snippet of information on these watches I'll throw up on the website at myjewelrybunch.com. But you can see here, these things are built really good. Hamilton made these watches, I think from about 1939 all the way up to 1945. And then, of course, after that, all the machining kind of went to Europe from Hamilton shortly after that. These military watches are built very, very well. I love them. They're just great watches. They're very durable. And I love the chronograph hand instead of a sweep. I love the sweep second hand chronograph hand type instead of the sub second hand that's usually on the third wheel. You can tell by the dial that these are matte black, and that was because they were used in low lighting, so the matte black would actually be easier to read. You got to be careful with these dials because they will mark easy. Most of these watches did not survive World War II. So when you find one that's in this good a condition, it's kind of nice to have a keeper in your collection. Now we're just going to take the watch apart. You can see I've gotten to the point now where I'm just checking the balance. It's kind of sticky for some reason. I'm not sure why. Like I said, the watch runs well when it's wound, but for some reason that balance just seems a little bit sticky, and I just want to go through the whole watch and see what it looks like inside since I've never opened this particular watch. Gently going to remove the balance cock here, and because the balance wheel is kind of stuck in there, I'm just going to move it off to the side, lift out the balance, and pull off the whole balance assembly. Throw that in the parts tray. You can see there's a little detent here. I can adjust that or pull that over just to make sure the spring's not wound. Now I'm going to pull off the sweep second hand pinion, which is mounted at this point here. So you're going to remove that one screw, and that little bridge holds the second hand pinion on. This one came off. It's kind of a little stuck in there, so we're going to go ahead and clean that particular part for sure. Here's the hack that shuts off the balance when you pull the stem out to the first click. I'm going to gently remove the pallet fork bridge here, and these two screws hold that bridge in place. Just grab these screws, put them in the parts tray. I like to keep everything in the parts tray when I'm working on a watch. Again, be very careful with these. You don't want to break the pallet fork when you pull this off, so you're going to gently lift that out. And grab that pallet fork out, put that in the parts tray as well. Let's just start taking off the ratchet wheel for the winding of the mainspring. So I'm going to pull this ratchet off. These screws are standard thread, so they are not reverse thread. This particular screw sometimes on older watches will be reverse thread. Actually, in most cases, it'll be a reverse threaded screw, so you want to be careful. I didn't have to pull this particular piece off of the bridge, but I wanted to check it because it winds kind of abnormally, so I just want to get in there and just see if there's any dirt or old oil or anything dried up inside. I'm going to pull that off, grab that ratchet, that winding ratchet wheel, and we'll put that in the parts tray. Now I'm going to start disassembling the bridges here. Now this is the train bridge. It's been a long time since I've taken one of these apart, and with some of these watches that have a sweep second hand, you have to be conscious of how the gears are placed inside. And I had just a little bit forgotten about how to disassemble this particular model watch. So you have to pull all the screws off of each bridge, and then you can disassemble the entire watch. Kind of makes for a little bit of extra thinking when you're doing this, but the assembly is a little more complicated. The watch will just be that much better, however. Make sure you have a nice sharp, straight, flat screwdriver, so when you pull those screws off, you don't slip or mark. We're going to pull both bridges off at the same time. Now that all the gears and everything are loose, it should come off relatively easy. We'll grab that main wheel, the train bridge, the escapement wheel, and the third wheel. We'll put those in the thing, in the parts tray, and then I'm going to grab all the extra little bits that are floating here. We got the mainspring barrel and then the clutch. Now here I'm going to disassemble the covers for the train gears. These are the cap jewels. There are hole jewels and cap jewels on the train itself, which is unusual for most pocket watches, but these military watches of this quality had these. You're going to pull off these caps and then put them aside. It's a nice one-piece plate. The jewels for the hole jewels for the pinions here are pressure fit in the watch. They don't come out unless you actually have to replace them. This is the lower balance cap jewel, so we're going to pull this off. Similar situation with the hole jewel for the balance. It is pressure fit into the case. You don't necessarily have to do anything with that if you're going to clean the entire watch. You just leave that in the full plate here. This is as far as I'm going. This watch is actually immaculate. I was pretty impressed with how clean it is. I've done maybe, 20 years ago, I used to fix these once a month. I used to see probably 6 to 10 a year. I don't see them as often. I'm just going to check the mainspring because this mainspring supposedly was replaced. I just want to double check. Now again, these World War II watches, they were made to be much more high quality. Everything kind of snaps together and fits in place. And looking at this mainspring, I can tell it is a newer mainspring, so it's not the original mainspring that would have been in this watch. It is very clean. It's not dry. There's no dirt or anything on this. I'm just going to give it a little bit of oil, spring oil on it just to keep it lubed up, and we'll put it back together. Again, this is more maintenance on this particular watch than a full service. I'll put the mainspring cover back on. There is a detent on the spring, so that little detent or indent in the cap fits right in there. It locks the mainspring in position. It's not a slip spring like you'd see on an automatic watch. These are fixed position springs. So once that barrel's back together, we can go ahead and clean everything. I've cleaned all the jewels. I've cleaned the balance out. I've cleaned the balance staff off. I've actually done the jewels, cleaned the jewels on the balance cock. Did that off camera. I won't bore you with the ultrasonic cleaners and all the chemicals. You guys know how to do that. So we're going to go ahead and start assembling this. Now, when I put this bridge in, I'm only going to tighten these screws down just about maybe 80%. So I want a little bit of play in them so I can seat everything correctly. Once these 3 screws are in position, then I can go ahead and tighten this plate down with the cap jewels on it. We'll go ahead and do the same with the balance cap jewel. Now they weren't dirty, but I cleaned them anyway. And what I found was whoever assembled this watch never oiled it. There's no sign of oil. There's no sign of dried oil. This watch was just never oiled. And that in itself, while it'll allow it to run and run well, it does definitely need a little bit of oil to keep itself timed correctly. There's going to be friction on a part that comes in contact with another. And again, I'm just checking the hack, make sure the hack there works. That protruding screw there, that's the stem release, and that ties down to the stem on the crown. So we'll go ahead and get the clutch set in the watch. Once that's in position, I can go ahead and insert the stem. And then I'll just tighten that screw up to hold the stem in position so we can go ahead, assemble the watch, and then test it without putting it in the case. Here you can see it works pretty good. Everything is smooth. I'm just going to go ahead and put a little grease on some of these little parts. Doesn't necessarily need them, but it's always good to have, especially if you're not going to run the watch all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and just drop a little bit of oil on each of the jewels and just make sure that they're all lubed up and ready to be assembled. And here you can see I'm just going to put a little bit of lube on the balance cock, or the upper balance jewel there, and we'll put that in and we'll give it a test. What I like to do is get the balance staff assembled with the cock there, and once the complete balance is reassembled, I go ahead and put that on the watch frame because I like to test the balance staff and the rotation of the balance with no parts in the watch, and this will give me a good idea of how well and how smooth that balance rotates and oscillates back and forth. And here you can see it's doing really well. Now again, this is in the face down position, so I'm going to go ahead and put the screw into the balance bridge, and that whole balance assembly will be tightened up to the frame, and we can go ahead, flip this over, and just make sure that we get the same situation where we have a nice smooth oscillating balance when it's face up. This is a good way to test a watch to make sure both the hairspring is good, that there's no issues with the balance. Make sure that you don't have any friction from dirt or dried oil still left on the jewels. And if you see it moving like this and it just wants to keep going, then you know you've got a watch that's pretty much cleaned up. I'll go ahead and remove this whole balance assembly again. Put everything back in the parts tray. And then we'll grab each part individually and start putting it all together. Now this is part of the ratcheting system for the winding and setting, and we're going to assemble this. I'm going to put a little dab of oil on this bridge here because that's where those two make contact. This inserts from the underside of this particular bridge. And then we have the cap on the top for the ratchet wheel. These are keyed so that they turn together. And you'll notice there's a little hole there, and that hole fits into a little pin on the other gear that we placed on the underside. I'm going to rotate this around until those line up, and that's where it is. And then I'll get the screw screwed on back. Again, this is a standard thread screw. Sometimes you will get a reverse thread screw on an older pocket watch. Now I'll go ahead and tighten that up, and it'll be ready to go back to assemble. Here you can see I'm putting the escape wheel on. The third wheel goes in after that. So this part of the train, I probably should have put those in before I put the main wheel in. And you can see, you'll notice that as we move forward with the assembly, I kind of screwed up the procedure here to insert these gears, because that main gear actually has to go in between those two gears on this bridge and then get fit together. You'll see that in just a moment. So I'm going to pull it out here again and get these all set right. If this were a standard Hamilton 992 or a 992B, you wouldn't have to deal with that. So you can see now that everything's seated correctly, I can put this bridge together with all the gears in place and gently align it. And what I'm going to do is just kind of very carefully push everything in place while turning the gears, just to make sure everything is seated correctly. Again, I always said this, put your bridge screws in and screw them down about 60%. You want enough play in them so that you can move the bridge around, move the gears without damaging anything. If you have a gear out of place, a pinion could get stuck underneath a jewel in the wrong position. If you tighten these down, you could crack a jewel, break a pinion, and then you're kind of out of luck. It is still very possible to get good parts for these particular watches. These 4992Bs, there are still a ton of new old stock for these. However, finding a watch in good condition tends to be the issue more than some of the parts that are available. Okay, so with that bridge in place, here's part of the assembly problem. The second bridge, the train bridge there, that's sitting on the pad, that has to go in kind of at the same time that these bridges go in together. It's kind of awkward to do. So I'm going to raise the main bridge up and then lift this train bridge in and push it in place very carefully as not to damage any gears. And once you do that, you can seat that real well. It'll go in. It'll seat pretty easily, except you'll have to mess with the two gears that are the escape wheel and the third wheel. You'll kind of have to mess with their positions to get them aligned correctly, because on these watches, it's a little tricky to get them lined up. But once they're lined up, this thing runs as smooth as it can be. I love this model watch because it's one of the smoothest watches ever made. It's just fantastic, fantastic quality watch. Again, we'll put these screws in, we'll tighten them down about 60%, and that'll give us enough play in them to adjust all the positions of each gear and seat them in their corresponding jewels. Here you can see I'm just kind of gently moving and poking the gears to fit them into their jewels. Once we get everything aligned, you'll see how smooth this watch moves. And I'm a little off camera here. My angle's kind of bad, but what I'm trying to do is just kind of get everything lined up. I will sometimes use a clean oiler to gently move them and pry them around. Oilers make for good tools to move things around because they don't do any damage to a watch. They bend easy and they'll break before part on the watch will. Once you get all the gears seated in their corresponding pivots on the jewels, you are in good shape to go ahead and start tightening everything down. Now it looks like I still have something out of place, so we're going to loosen it up and go ahead and check everything else. That's why you never tighten anything completely. You just kind of go in baby steps and check along the way. There we go. So sometimes just turning the gears just kind of seats them correctly, and you can see everything starts running a lot more smooth. Once that's the case, we can go ahead and just tighten everything up. Again, I'm going to take a clean oiler and I'm just going to test the gears and make sure everything is smooth. So if you're used to working on old pocket watches and you get one like this made in the 1940s, especially these military versions, you can see the quality of the manufacturing on this watch is just outstanding. Most pocket watches, even railroad watches from the turn of the last century, they do not operate as smoothly as this particular model watch does. We're just going to get that winding ratchet gear in place for the balance wheel, or the mainspring, and we'll tighten that down. Again, these screws do not have to be over tightened. Please don't over tighten them. You can fracture the head right off the screw. And I'm just going to give it a quick test to make sure everything is running smooth, and we're in good shape. Now let's get to working on the pallet fork. So we're going to reassemble the pallet and get that in shape here. I'm just going to put a little dab of oil on both the balance jewel and the pallet fork jewels there, just to keep them lubed up. You're going to line up your pallet fork, make sure it's in position. And again, we want to be careful. Here you can see I'm just oiling the upper jewel for that pallet bridge. I'm going to get this in place. Typically, I'll put one screw in. I'll tighten it down about 50 to 60%. And then I will start moving the pallet fork back and forth just to make sure it's seated correctly in the jewels and that we're not going to run into any problem. If you see any wobble in that balance or that pallet fork, you do not want to tighten those screws down. Here I'm in good shape. The pallet fork is seated correctly. And if I put a little pressure on the mainspring, it'll actually want to click by itself. We'll add the second screw to that bridge and we'll tighten it up. And here you can see I'm just kind of pushing it with a clean oiler, and I'm just going to see if it wants to click by itself. You can see it pushes itself left to right very, very easily. And that itself was what drives power to the balance wheel. And that's actually the part that makes the clicking noise when you hear an old watch. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the balance wheel back onto the watch. Sorry for the misalignment of the camera. I am working with a new camera, guys. I'm a little getting quite used to it here after playing with it for a little bit. It does take good quality video. At least that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And here you can see once the balance is seated correctly, that balance staff just starts oscillating on its own, and we like to see that. I'm going to go ahead and tighten in that balance cock screw, and we'll get this tightened up. And here I'm testing the hack, make sure that when I pull the crown out, it stops the watch. That was a military thing that was kind of introduced in the 30s, really became popular in the 40s during World War II. And that was so everybody could synchronize their clocks or their watches when they were on missions. Okay, so the watch is back to working. I think we're almost done. We just got to get everything on the upper side working. And that would be the next step to get the dial seated correctly, get the upper part, the cannon pinion, the hour wheel, that all has to go back together. So again, I'm just playing, just making sure everything works right. It should start and stop on its own. If it's got a little problem there, then we'll have to address it. Oh, before I forget, here we've got to add in the sweep second hand pinion and the bridge for that. So in my life, I've worked on, I can't tell you how many watches, but I think some of the watches that I've worked on, well, if you wanted to know what my personal opinion is as far as serviceability and quality of manufacturing, I would say Rolexes made anytime after 1990, and these Hamilton watches made for the military during World War II are very comparable in quality of manufacturing. They run very, very well. They will last a lifetime if taken care of, and they don't even have to be, delicately taken care of. They can take a good abuse. All right, I'm going to get that cannon pinion back on the movement. Remember, the cannon pinion is what holds on the minute hand. It also snaps onto the main wheel of the watch. This is the hour wheel, and we've got a dial washer. I'm going to go ahead and just adjust that. The hour wheel, obviously, is the gear that holds the hour hand on the watch. I'm going to go ahead and reseat the dial, tighten the 3 screws that hold that dial in position. And once that's done, we'll again start the watch, just make sure everything's working. Every time you add a piece back to a movement, you should go ahead and test it, make sure that everything it's supposed to do is working correctly. I'm going to go ahead and remove the stem and crown. We'll put the watch movement back in its case and get the stem and crown back into the movement. Now we can go ahead and put the case screws on. Most pocket watches or watches like this will have 2 screws that hold the watch movement to the case. That is still the case with most mechanical watches today, even some quartz watches. Go ahead and put the back cover back on this watch. And now it's time to set the hands. Of course, you're always going to start with the lowest hand. In this case, it is the hour hand. It looks like at some point in time, somebody painted these with some white enamel paint. Did not do a good job. I may actually sand them down and use some glow, some luminescence, just to redo them. Then again, you're going to line the minute hand, and then make sure that the hour hand and the minute hand are separated by at least 1/4 of a millimeter. That way there's no indication that those hands will rub each other and stop. Once you've got that all squared away, go ahead and put your second hand on. In this case, it's a sweep second hand. One cool thing about the military, these watches were serviced depending on the number of missions. They would typically get serviced every 60 days to 90 days. So if you had one of these on a B-19 for a bombing run, you would time it out, how many seconds you needed to be from one position to another for your waypoints. And these things were tested for accuracy frequently. And let's just say a B-29 bomber got one of these for the bombardier. If it went off for service, he'd get another one right away. So you never had the same mechanical watch at the bombardier station, but you know, they all use the same model. And there we have it. Put the watch back together. Crystal is set. The time is set. The watch runs. It winds perfectly. Everything about this watch is just fantastic. Of course, I'm going to keep this because it is my absolute favorite pocket watch of all time. Again, this is the Hamilton 4992B military 24-hour indicator watch. Fantastic watch, fantastic movement. And it is based off of the 4992 with some major modifications to gearing. There you have it. Guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to know anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, please share my videos. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I read them all. I don't always respond or can't always find the time to respond, but I do read all the ones, all the comments you guys leave, and I do appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys all have a great day, and take care.